The Roman Empire stretched like a vast tapestry across the world, its roads winding over mountains and plains, its legions stationed at distant borders, its cities shimmering with marble, fountains, and markets alive with voices. Yet within its capital, beneath the weight of its triumphs and the silence of its monuments, life unfolded at a slower pace, one that could be felt by those who lingered in its courtyards at dusk. Rome was more than a city. It was a heart that beat for millions, a place where power and ambition were woven together with the quiet daily rhythm of ordinary lives. And within this immense, eternal stage, one woman's story was destined to stand apart, a story that would linger across centuries. Her name was Valeria Messalina, and though history painted her in hues of passion and betrayal, there was also the quiet undertone of humanity, a woman shaped by her time, by her lineage, and by the currents of empire itself. The air in Rome during the reign of Emperor Claudius was heavy, with both the calm of stability and the restlessness of change. Claudius, who had come to power almost by accident after the assassination of his nephew Caligula, carried himself with a mixture of caution and resolve. He was no warrior king. Instead, he was a man of thought, a scholar in an age of soldiers. His stammering speech and hesitant manner often gave the impression of timidity. But beneath the surface there was a sharp intelligence, one that sought to govern wisely, one that looked to law, to administration, and to the balance of order. And beside him stood his young wife, Messalina, whose beauty and charm would captivate Rome, whose presence in the imperial palace would become both alluring and unsettling. The palace itself was a world apart, beyond the bustling streets where merchants displayed silks and spices, beyond the crowded taverns where sailors told their tales. The Palatine Hill rose, crowned with marble halls, colonnades, and gardens fragrant with laurel and rose. At night, when torches flickered along its walkways, the palace seemed to hover above the city, a realm of quiet power, where decisions made in whispers could shift the fate of provinces far away. It was here that Messalina lived, walked, and dreamed. Her name was often spoken with awe, sometimes with fear, always with fascination. And yet, like all who rise into the gaze of history, she began as a child of a family, a daughter born into the noble Valeri clan. Her life shaped not by choice but by destiny. Messalina's early years are known only in fragments, as though viewed through a veil of mist. Born into an ancient and respected family, her lineage carried both prestige and expectation. The Valeri had long served Rome, their name etched into its history. It was a household of tradition, of stories told across generations, of marble busts that reminded each child of the greatness to which they must aspire. For Messalina, the pathways of her youth were those of privilege, but also of inevitability. She learned the arts expected of noble Roman women, the careful management of household affairs, the grace of bearing, the art of speech and silence. Yet, woven into her upbringing, there was also the subtle understanding that her life would be bound to the will of empire, that her marriage would serve not only her family but Rome itself. In her girlhood, she might have walked beneath the shade of colonnades, the marble cool beneath her hands as she traced the carvings of ivy and laurel that adorned the walls. She might have paused at fountains where water spilled with gentle murmur, reflecting the sky above. She might have heard, in the distance, the sound of soldiers drilling on the field of Mars, their shields clashing in rhythm, their voices rising in chants that echoed across the city. These impressions of order, of beauty, of the endless hum of Rome, would have formed the background of her life, a world where power was constant, even when unseen. When she was still very young, Messalina was married to Claudius, a man much older than herself, a man whose path to the throne was as unexpected as it was precarious. To some, the match might have seemed unlikely. Claudius, with his scholarly mind, his halting words, his cautious ways, was a figure often overlooked within his own family. But when chance placed the diadem of Rome upon his brow, Messalina became not merely a wife, but the empress of the world's greatest power. She was still barely past girlhood, yet she now stood beside a man who carried the fate of nations in his hands. The people of Rome looked to her with curiosity. They had known empresses before: the stately Livia, the fiery Agrippina, the elder, the erratic Caesonia. But Messalina was different. She was young, strikingly beautiful, and possessed of a liveliness that stood in contrast to the measured ways of her husband. Wherever she appeared, eyes followed, whispers trailed behind her, some admiring, some wary. In the theatre, where Romans gathered for plays and spectacles, her presence was noted like a bright star among the audience. In the forums, where statues and honorifics stood tall, her image began to weave itself into the city's imagination. Yet beauty in Rome was always shadowed by danger. To be admired was to invite envy. To be powerful was to awaken suspicion. Within the palace walls, where courtiers moved with careful steps and senators weighed their words like gold, Messalina's charm was both a gift and a burden. She held influence over Claudius, that much was clear, and in an empire where influence was currency, such power could inspire both allies and rivals. Still, in these early days, her life was touched with ease. She bore children, Octavia and Britannicus, whose names would echo through Rome's story. She walked the gardens of the Palatine, where olive trees whispered in the wind, where statues of gods stood in silent watch. She dined in halls lit by golden lamps, where poets recited verses, where musicians played softly upon strings and flutes, and she watched as her husband, the unlikely emperor, worked tirelessly at his desk, poring over documents, issuing edicts, extending Rome's authority into new provinces. But even as Claudius sought order, Rome was a city where order was fragile. Beneath the marble, beneath the discipline of soldiers and the majesty of law, there pulsed the restless currents of ambition, intrigue, and desire. Senators plotted in the shadows of freedmen, powerful in their proximity to the emperor, whispered advice that could sway the course of policy. Families vied for influence, weaving alliances with marriages, testing loyalties with favors. And within this ever-turning web, Messalina began to carve her own path to later historians. Her name would become almost synonymous with excess, with passion unchecked, with schemes that bordered on audacity. Yet when we look gently, as we do now in the stillness of night, we see not only scandal, but also a young woman navigating the vast machinery of empire, seeking agency in a world that both elevated and confined her. She was not merely a wife, not merely a figure of beauty, but a participant in the grand story of Rome, one whose choices would ripple through years to come. The Rome of Messalina's time was a place of contrasts. Its streets were filled with the bustle of merchants, with the cries of children, with the chants of priests. Its aqueducts carried clear water into fountains where the weary could refresh themselves. Its temples stood in solemn grace, adorned with offerings, alive with incense and prayer. And yet, not far from these places of order, there were shadows, alleyways where the poor huddled, taverns where secrets were traded, arenas where life and death played out before roaring crowds. Messalina lived at the very center of this world, yet her story would reach into every corner of it, touching both the high and the low, both the powerful and the powerless. As the years unfolded, whispers around her grew louder. Stories of her boldness, her desires, her plots began to weave themselves into Rome's gossip, spreading like ivy across a wall. Some of these tales were no doubt exaggerated, sharpened by enemies who feared her influence, colored by moralists who sought to make her an example. Yet others carried the weight of truth, for Messalina was not content to be passive. She moved, she acted, she sought, always with a daring that seemed almost reckless, but also undeniably compelling. In the stillness of her chambers, perhaps by lamplight, she might have looked out over the sleeping city. The torches on the streets below flickered like stars scattered upon the earth. The hum of Rome quieted into the night, leaving only the faint sounds of distant voices, of horses' hooves fading on the stones. And in that solitude, perhaps she dreamed of love, of power, of freedom from the confines of tradition, dreams that would soon carry her into the heart of both admiration and peril. Messalina's tale, as it would be told by ancient historians, would come to embody the themes of desire and betrayal. But here, in these opening moments, it is enough to see her as she was, a young empress in the prime of life, walking the marble corridors of the palace, smiling as her children played, speaking softly to her husband as he traced words upon scrolls, and stepping with grace into the gaze of an empire that would never forget her name. Her story was just beginning, and though the path ahead would be tangled with intrigue and shadow, in these first days her presence shone like a lamp in Rome's vast night. And it is here, in this quiet glow, that we leave her for now, standing at the threshold of a story that would shape not only her own life, but the very memory of Rome itself. The story of Messalina began in youth and promise, but it was within the palace, in the quiet turning of years, that her character unfolded like the petals of a flower slowly opening under the Roman sun. The empire was vast, but at its heart lay the emperor and his household. And in that household, Messalina was not a figure to be ignored. Her influence, though subtle at first, grew steadily, as drops of water carve stone, not with force but with persistence. The marriage between Claudius and Messalina was one that joined not just two individuals, but two ways of life. Claudius, careful, scholarly, deliberate, seemed almost to embody the weight of Rome's traditions, its reliance on law and structure. Messalina, younger, more spirited, embodied vitality, charm, and the pull of emotion. To those who observed them from the outside, it seemed a curious union. Some wondered whether the emperor was enchanted by her beauty alone, or whether he recognized in her a presence that made his own authority appear more human, more approachable to a people accustomed to rulers cloaked in stern dignity. Messalina's role as empress was multifaceted. To the people of Rome, she was a symbol of fertility and continuity, a mother to the children who might inherit the empire, a figure who carried with her the promise of dynastic stability. Octavia and Britannicus, her children by Claudius, were not merely her offspring. They were embodiments of Rome's future. When the people saw Messalina with her young ones, they saw not just a mother, but the beating heart of imperial continuity. It was a role that softened her image, drawing admiration and affection. Yet, beyond the public eye, her influence extended into the inner workings of power. Claudius, for all his intelligence, often leaned on those around him. Freedmen, secretaries, generals, and senators vied for his ear, each seeking to shape decisions that could sway the empire's direction. Within this circle, Messalina found her place. She was not silent in the halls of decision. She was present, offering her counsel in ways that might have seemed natural at first, but which gradually grew into true influence. At banquets, where golden lamps flickered against polished marble, where voices mingled in laughter and the soft music of lyres drifted through the air, Messalina often sat beside her husband, her words gentle but persuasive. Those who dined in her company noted not only her beauty, but the ease with which she could turn conversation, the way she could make even the most guarded senator open his thoughts. There was warmth in her presence, but beneath it lay a mind that knew how to weave suggestion into conviction. Rome itself was a city of whispers, and in the age of Claudius, the whispers often concerned Messalina. Some said she was ambitious, too eager to hold sway where tradition dictated restraint. Others said she was generous, a patroness of those who sought advancement, a friend to those overlooked by the rigid hierarchy of senators and patricians. Still others spoke of her private life in tones that blurred the line between truth and exaggeration. But in Rome, reputation was as powerful as reality. A single rumor could ripple outward until it reached the very steps of the Senate, until it was carved into the minds of people who never saw the palace walls. Messalina was aware of this, and she lived with it as one might live with a constant wind. She knew that every gesture, every word, could be magnified, and so she cultivated an image of abundance, of liveliness, of presence. When festivals lit the streets with garlands and music, she appeared among the people, radiant, admired, the very embodiment of Roman prosperity. When poets recited verses in honor of gods and emperors, her name was sometimes woven into their lines, as though she herself were a figure of myth and legend. Within the palace, she fostered alliances. Servants adored her, for she treated them with a familiarity that gave them dignity. Courtiers sought her favor, for they knew that the emperor often listened to her voice. Families connected themselves to her through friendship, hoping to bind their fortunes to her rising star. Yet with every alliance came the possibility of enmity, and those who felt excluded or overshadowed began to murmur in discontent. It was the nature of power. It attracted both devotion and rivalry. The Roman world itself provided the backdrop, against which Messalina's story unfolded. Beyond the palace, legions marched to the edges of the empire, securing borders, building roads, raising fortresses. Governors in far provinces administered justice, collected taxes, and sent back reports written on wax tablets and papyrus scrolls. Merchants carried goods across seas and rivers, filling Rome with spices from the east, amber from the north, and silks that shimmered in the light. And in the midst of this grand machinery, the Empress's name traveled as well, her reputation stretching far beyond the city, carried in letters, in gossip, in official decrees stamped with the emperor's seal. Messalina's gardens were among her most cherished spaces. It was said that she delighted in strolling among the trees, where vines climbed over trellises and roses bloomed in vibrant clusters. The murmur of fountains created a background of peace, and statues of nymphs and satyrs watched silently from their pedestals. Here, away from the endless formalities of court life, she could relax, could breathe freely. Perhaps she entertained trusted friends here, walking slowly along gravel paths, speaking in low voices of hopes, of fears, of possibilities. In such moments, her humanity was most visible, not an empress, but a woman, thoughtful and searching. Her relationship with Claudius was one that fascinated Rome. He, so often described as cautious and deliberate, seemed softened in her presence. There are accounts that suggest he was deeply devoted to her, that her laughter could draw from him a warmth rarely seen in his public life. Whether out of genuine love or the natural closeness of shared power, their bond appeared strong in the early years. But such bonds, in the world of emperors, were fragile, for the empire demanded not only loyalty but appearances, and appearances could shift with a single event. As Messalina grew in confidence, so too did the stories about her. Some painted her as a woman of boundless desire, others as a manipulator, still others as a patroness of the arts and a supporter of those who might otherwise be overlooked. It is impossible now to separate fully the truth from the embellishments of history. What can be said with certainty is that she left a mark. Her presence was undeniable, her influence real, her name unforgettable. The evenings in Rome stretched long, filled with the glow of oil lamps and the hum of conversation. In the theatre, actors declaimed tragedies and comedies, their gestures large, their voices carrying through the marble seats. In the circus, Maximus, the thundering of chariots, stirred the crowds into roars of excitement, the colors of the racing factions fluttering like banners of loyalty. And in the quieter corners of the city, philosophers gathered in porticos to discuss the nature of fate, of virtue, of the god's will. Among all these scenes, the name of Messalina hovered like a subtle refrain, appearing in poems, in gossip, in cautious praise. There was, always, a contrast to her, the figure of Agrippina the younger, her future rival, who even then watched with careful eyes, biding her time. Rome was never without competition, and among the women of the imperial family, the competition was often silent, but sharp. Agrippina, with her lineage and her ambition, was a shadow in the distance, but a shadow that grew steadily, waiting for its moment to step forward. For now, however, Messalina's light shone brightly. She was the Empress, the wife of the Emperor, the mother of his children, the figure who filled the palace with liveliness. And as Rome drifted into sleep each night, as the torches guttered and the city grew still, her presence remained like a glow upon the Palatine Hill, a reminder that within those walls lived a woman whose story was far from finished, a story that would wind its way into betrayal, into legend, and into the very heart of Roman memory. And so, the night carried her name, Messalina, the Empress. Messalina, the presence beside Claudius. Messalina, whose footsteps echoed softly on marble floors, whose laughter drifted into the night, whose image would one day be remembered not only for its beauty, but for the shadow it cast upon the empire she graced. The years that followed saw Messalina's place within the empire expand in ways both visible and hidden, like ripples spreading outward across the still surface of a fountain. At first, her influence seemed merely domestic, tied to her role as empress, mother, and wife. But as the seasons turned and the rhythms of Rome unfolded, it became clear that her hand reached further, into places where decisions were made and futures shaped. Messalina understood, perhaps instinctively, that power in Rome was not always declared openly. It was often the product of unseen threads, woven through conversations, favors, friendships, and debts. In this she was skilled. She knew how to listen, how to charm, how to allow others to believe they acted by their own will, when in truth they had been guided gently toward her desires. She cultivated relationships with freedmen, those secretaries and administrators who managed the machinery of empire behind the emperor's throne. These men, dismissed by some senators as mere servants, wielded immense practical power, for it was through their hands that documents passed, that edicts were written, that orders were sent to the provinces. Winning their loyalty was as valuable as winning a legion. She also fostered bonds with nobles who found themselves on the margins of favor. Rome's senatorial class was vast, and not every family enjoyed the emperor's ear. To these overlooked men, Messalina could extend a smile, a word of encouragement, perhaps even intercede on their behalf. In this way, she gathered supporters, weaving around herself a web of gratitude and obligation. For those who felt excluded by Claudius's cautious hand, Messalina seemed like an open door. Her gardens became more than places of beauty. They became stages for influence. Beneath the vines heavy with grapes, beneath the marble gazes of statues that looked on in silence, Messalina welcomed guests. These gatherings, though clothed in the appearance of leisure, often carried weight. Over cups of wine, over the gentle strains of music, words were exchanged that could alter the fortunes of families. Promises were made, alliances sealed, all under the guise of relaxation and entertainment. The gardens were fragrant with roses, but also with possibility. As her presence grew, so too did the stories. Rome was a city of storytellers, where taverns echoed with tales and markets hummed with rumor. The people loved to imagine the lives of their rulers, and Messalina, with her beauty and vivacity, provided endless material. Some said she was endlessly indulgent, driven by desires that knew no bounds. Others claimed she was generous, a benefactor to poets and artists, a woman who supported creativity in a city that thrived on culture. Still, others whispered that her charm masked a dangerous hunger for influence, that she sought to control not only the emperor, but the empire itself. It is difficult now, so many centuries later, to know how much of this was truth, and how much exaggeration. What can be said with certainty is that her image grew increasingly complex. To some she was a symbol of Rome's prosperity, the glittering counterpart to Claudius's cautious reign. To others she was a storm gathering quietly, her radiance concealing a turbulence that might one day break forth. Messalina herself must have been aware of the whispers. How could she not, when they echoed, even in the marble halls of the palace? Yet she moved through them with poise, as though the murmurs were no more than the rustle of leaves in her gardens. Perhaps she knew that so long as Claudius trusted her, so long as she remained the mother of his heirs, the rumors could not touch her. Or perhaps she underestimated the power of reputation in a city where perception often carried more weight than truth. Claudius, for his part, seemed devoted still. He relied on her presence, perhaps more than he realized. His reign, though marked by stability and careful administration, was often criticized by senators who resented his reliance on freedmen and women. In Messalina, Claudius found not only companionship, but also a figure who could absorb some of that resentment, who could deflect attention from his own cautious decisions. She became, in a way, both shield and mirror, reflecting the emperor's humanity while shielding him from some of the sharpest critiques. The balance of their relationship, however, was delicate. Claudius was not without suspicion. He was cautious by nature, shaped by years of being overlooked and underestimated before he came to power. Yet in Messalina, he seemed to set aside his caution, trusting where perhaps another man might have questioned. It was a trust that would, in time, be tested in ways that neither could yet foresee. As her role expanded, Messalina also engaged in patronage. Poets sought her support, writing verses that praised her beauty, her generosity, her connection to the divine. Artists dedicated works to her, carving her likeness in marble, painting her image on frescoes that adorned villas. These works did more than flatter. They solidified her presence in the cultural fabric of Rome. To see her image was to be reminded of her influence, to recognize that she was not merely a wife and mother, but a figure whose presence touched the daily lives of citizens. Even in the distant provinces, her name carried weight. Governors who received orders from Claudius knew that behind the seal of the emperor might lie the subtle suggestion of the Empress. Traders returning from Rome carried not only goods but also stories, and in those stories Messalina appeared as a figure of fascination. The provinces, far removed from the reality of her presence, built images of her in their minds, shaped by rumor and imagination. To them she was almost mythical, a woman whose charms and ambitions blurred the line between history and legend. Her relationship with the imperial children added to her image. Octavia, her daughter, was raised with care, groomed for the role she might one day play in securing alliances through marriage. Britannicus, her son, was seen as the future of Rome, a living symbol of the continuity of the Julio-Claudian line. Messalina, as their mother, was central to this vision of dynastic stability. To support her was to support the future of the empire itself. Yet not all viewed her with admiration. There were those who resented her influence, who saw in her growing presence a challenge to tradition. In Rome, the idea of a woman wielding such sway was unsettling to many, particularly to senators who prided themselves on the authority of their class. They muttered against her in private, their words dripping with disdain, calling her excessive, manipulative, dangerous. But though they spoke, they did not act. For to act against her was to act against Claudius himself, and that was a risk few were willing to take. At night, when Rome's streets grew quiet, when the lamps flickered in the upper rooms of palaces, Messalina's story was told again and again. Lovers whispered her name as though it carried a dangerous sweetness. Servants gossiped about her with a mixture of admiration and fear. Poets wove her into their verses, half in praise, half in warning. She had become more than a woman. She was a symbol, a figure whose reputation seemed to expand with every retelling. In this expansion lay both her power and her peril. The greater her presence, the more she drew eyes upon her. The more she drew eyes, the more her actions were scrutinized, magnified, twisted into tales that carried further than the truth ever could. Rome was a city that devoured stories, and Messalina was becoming one of its favorites. And so, her days passed in brilliance and in shadow. She walked among her gardens, the roses blooming red as the setting sun. She sat beside Claudius at banquets, her laughter rising above the music of lyres. She whispered to freedmen and senators, shaping decisions with a light touch. She played with her children, her gaze softening in moments of intimacy. She lived a life that was both deeply human and impossibly legendary, a life that would, in time, give rise to tales of lust, betrayal, and downfall. But for now, the story was still unfolding, the shadows not yet fully drawn. Messalina was, in these years, at the height of her presence. Her beauty was spoken of in every corner of the city. Her influence was felt in every chamber of the palace. Her laughter, her words, her very presence filled Rome with both admiration and unease. And as the empire continued its endless march through time, her story deepened, becoming ever more entangled with the fate of Claudius, with the whispers of rivals, with the watchful eyes of those who waited in silence for the moment when her brilliance might falter. For in Rome, no light shone forever without casting a shadow. The years continued to flow like a steady river, each season carrying with it new currents in Rome's story and in Messalina's life. Though she remained radiant and admired, the balance around her began to shift in subtle ways. The same qualities that had once inspired fascination now stirred unease in some, and where there had once been admiration, there began to appear shadows of resentment. It was not unusual in Rome for those in high places to gather both supporters and rivals. Power itself was magnetic, drawing devotion from some and envy from others. Messalina was no exception. As her gardens filled with guests, as her name appeared more frequently in verses and rumors, more eyes turned toward her with a mixture of awe and suspicion. The Senate, always a body quick to guard its traditions, began to murmur more openly. Many of its members already chafed at the authority Claudius had granted to freedmen, men they considered beneath their dignity. To see a woman, even the Empress, wield such quiet influence was another wound to their pride. They watched Messalina with narrowed eyes, whispering that she overstepped, that her laughter carried too far, that her presence overshadowed the dignity of the emperor himself. And yet, none dared challenge her directly. To stand against Messalina was to risk standing against Claudius, and the emperor's loyalty to his wife remained clear. He trusted her, valued her companionship, and perhaps even relied upon her counsel more than he admitted. As long as his favor endured, Messalina's position seemed secure. Still, the whispers grew, threading through the marble halls and colonnaded streets like a faint breeze before a storm. Messalina herself seemed undisturbed. She continued to walk in her gardens, to host her gatherings, to laugh as though the world itself was filled only with delight. But beneath the surface, she must have sensed the shifting currents. No one so attuned to influence could fail to notice the glances, the hesitations, the subtle signs that not all hearts in Rome beat warmly toward her. Her response was not retreat, but expansion. She sought to secure her presence more firmly, weaving herself deeper into the fabric of Rome's society. She offered her patronage more generously, ensuring that poets sang her name, that artists painted her likeness, that the city itself seemed to carry echoes of her existence. By tying her image to the culture of the empire, she made herself harder to erase. Each statue, each fresco, each verse was another stone in the edifice of her reputation, a monument to her presence that whispers alone could not topple. She also leaned more heavily upon her allies among the freedmen, those who managed the daily workings of the empire. These men, often overlooked by the Senate, owed much to Claudius and to Messalina. Their loyalty was a strong shield, and their influence considerable. Through them, Messalina could touch decisions far beyond her reach in name, ensuring that her voice was heard even when it was not spoken aloud. But with expansion came risk. The more visible her influence, the harder it was to disguise. Senators who once grumbled in private began to gather courage, sharing their concerns more boldly. Some spoke of morality, casting Messalina as a figure whose indulgence endangered the dignity of the empire. Others framed their resentment as a defense of tradition, arguing that Rome had always been a state of men, guided by senators, not by the whispers of women or the pens of freedmen. Beneath these arguments lay envy, and perhaps fear that their own power was slipping into the hands of those they considered unworthy. Stories about Messalina multiplied in this fertile soil. Some claimed she was endlessly extravagant, hosting feasts that rivaled the splendor of the gods. Others whispered that she manipulated marriages, arranging unions to strengthen her own influence. There were even those who suggested she entertained ambitions beyond her station, though what form those ambitions might take was never made clear. The stories, whether true or false, were retold in taverns and markets, embroidered with each telling until they became larger than life. And yet, despite the rumors, despite the resentment, Messalina's star continued to shine. Her beauty was undiminished, her presence undaunted. She walked through the city with poise, her garments flowing like rivers of silk, her hair gleaming in the sunlight. The people still admired her, drawn to her radiance as moths to flame. Children gazed at her with wonder, poets with longing, rivals with guarded calculation. Claudius, still devoted, seemed unwilling to see the shadows gathering around her. Perhaps he knew, but chose to ignore them. Perhaps he believed that the loyalty of the people and the strength of the legions would outweigh the murmurs of discontent, or perhaps he was blinded by affection, unable to imagine that his Empress could ever become a threat to his reign. Within the palace, the atmosphere grew more complex. Servants, ever alert to shifts in power, carried tales from one chamber to another. Freedmen whispered among themselves, weighing the risks of continued loyalty against the dangers of disfavor. Messalina's allies sought to secure her position, while her rivals looked for cracks in her armor. The air was heavy with anticipation, as though the city itself waited for some unseen drama to unfold. Through it all, Messalina remained a figure of grace. In her gardens, she strolled among roses that bloomed in endless succession, their petals soft as whispers. She welcomed guests with a smile, her voice soothing, her laughter bright. She played with her children, her affection genuine, her gaze tender. She was, in these moments, not the Empress of rumor, but a mother, a wife, a woman of flesh and blood. But Rome, ever hungry for stories, preferred the legend. To the city, Messalina was not merely a woman. She was a symbol of indulgence, of ambition, of beauty that dazzled and deceived. Her name carried weight, her presence stirred imaginations. Her reputation, fair or unfair, became a mirror in which Rome saw both its prosperity and its unease. And so the tension grew, quietly, steadily, like water pressing against the walls of a dam. Each rumor, each whisper, each sidelong glance added to the pressure. Messalina, radiant and seemingly untroubled, continued her dance of influence, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that the walls could not hold forever. For now, the nights in Rome were still filled with music, the banquets still glowed with light, the gardens still bloomed with roses. But beneath the beauty, beneath the laughter, beneath the calm surface of imperial life, the currents deepened. The city waited, as it always did, for the next turn in the story, for the moment when brilliance and shadow would meet, and the tale of Messalina would move into its next, inevitable act. Rome glimmered as though under a spell, and at the heart of that spell moved Messalina, with her light touch and her easy laughter. The years that followed were years of her greatest splendor, when the gardens she loved grew more fragrant, the banquets more dazzling, and the city seemed to hum with her presence. Everywhere she went, eyes turned toward her, and voices softened into whispers. Her beauty had become the stuff of legend, not just in Rome, but beyond, carried in letters and tales that reached the provinces. Travelers spoke of her as though she were a vision seen only once in a lifetime, and those who had never beheld her in person imagined her in the way one imagines a goddess beyond the grasp of the ordinary. radiant with something more than human. In her banquets, the air shimmered with light reflected from polished silver and golden cups. Tables stretched long and wide, heavy with fruits, with roasted delicacies, with sauces fragrant with herbs brought from distant lands. Music drifted like a warm tide, played on strings and flutes, mingling with the murmur of voices. Guests reclined upon couches spread with soft cloth, their faces glowing with wine, their eyes following the Empress as she moved with ease among them. She did not preside from a distance, as some noblewomen might have done. She drew close, spoke warmly, shared laughter, and carried herself with an air that was neither aloof nor stern, but inviting, like sunlight falling through leaves. This was part of her power, her ability to dissolve formality, to make her presence feel not like a command, but like a gift. Yet, while her hand was light, the impression it left was deep. Each guest, when departing her gatherings, carried not only memories of the feast, but the sense that they had brushed against something extraordinary. And so her name was repeated, her image spread, and her legend grew ever larger. But extravagance, however dazzling, is never without consequence. For every admirer who marveled at the richness of her banquets, there was another who counted the cost. For every poet who sang of her beauty, there was a senator who grumbled that Rome's traditions were being drowned beneath waves of indulgence. The Senate, already uneasy with her influence, found in these spectacles more cause for complaint. They saw in Messalina's feasts not charm, but excess. They whispered that the empire's dignity was being compromised by an empress who reveled too freely, who invited artists and freedmen into circles once reserved for Rome's noblest. They told themselves that their concern was for tradition, but beneath it all was envy, sharpened by the undeniable truth that her name carried more weight among the people than many of their own. Messalina, for her part, seemed untouched by such mutterings. She continued to open her gardens, to welcome poets and musicians, to let art and beauty flourish around her. Perhaps she believed that by surrounding herself with joy, she could drown out discontent. Or perhaps she simply chose not to hear it, for to dwell too long on suspicion would have been to dim the radiance of the life she cultivated beyond the walls of the Senate. The people adored her still. In the markets, her name was spoken with affection, not anger. Women admired her finery, men her presence, children her gentleness when she passed through the streets. To the common heart of Rome, Messalina was not an empress of scandal, but a figure of wonder, someone who seemed to embody both the wealth and the softness of an age at peace. And Claudius, ever steady, stood by her side. His affection for her remained, his loyalty visible in the way he defended her name against grumblings he must have heard. Perhaps he saw in her radiance a complement to his own quieter nature. Where he was cautious, she was bold. Where he was slow to act, she was quick to charm. Together, they formed a balance at least. To the eyes of those who still believed, harmony reigned in the palace. But harmony, in Rome, was always fragile. Beneath the glow of feasts and the perfume of gardens, rivalries stirred more keenly than before. The more her extravagance shone, the more clearly her rivals marked her as a threat. For them, each banquet was not merely a feast, but a demonstration of power. Each verse praising her beauty was a reminder that their own names were fading from the songs of the city. The whispers that spread now were sharper than the old ones. They no longer spoke only of indulgence, but of danger, suggesting that Messalina's influence was growing beyond what was safe, that she was a shadow beside the emperor, more vivid to the people than Claudius himself. And while such whispers were still spoken in secret, they spread quickly, carried by servants, by merchants, by anyone who had seen the empress move with grace through her shimmering banquets. Messalina must have felt it, in some measure, even surrounded by music and laughter. No one so keen could have failed to sense the tightening of the air, the subtle sharpening of glances, the faint hesitation of some who once spoke freely. Perhaps she dismissed it, telling herself that envy was inevitable. Perhaps she believed that her radiance would outshine even suspicion. Or perhaps she knew, and accepted, that danger was part of the cost of brilliance. Still, she did not retreat. The banquets continued, the gardens bloomed, the laughter rang. If anything, her presence seemed to grow brighter, as though she sought to answer the whispers not with silence, but with greater radiance. The more they murmured, the more she shone. And so Rome drifted deeper into its paradox, an empress both beloved and resented, a woman whose beauty was praised in the streets and questioned in the Senate, a presence that seemed both gift and threat. To some, Messalina was joy embodied. To others, she was indulgence made flesh. To all, she was unforgettable. The city itself seemed to pause, as though waiting to see what would come of it all. Would her brilliance continue to dazzle, softening even her critics? Or would the weight of envy, resentment, and suspicion finally tip the balance? For now, the music still played, the roses still bloomed, the feasts still glowed. But beneath the glow, Rome held its breath, sensing that the story of Messalina, radiant and unyielding, was far from finished. The seasons passed, and with them the tides of Rome shifted, sometimes softly, sometimes with sudden undercurrents that few could name until they were caught within them. Messalina, still radiant at the height of her beauty and power, found herself walking a path lined with both roses and thorns, for while the roses still bloomed brightly in her gardens, perfuming the air with sweetness, the thorns of envy and suspicion began to press more closely than before. Rome was a city where nothing went unnoticed for long. Every gesture, every whisper, every glance in the palace found its echo in the streets, in the Senate, in the gossip of the markets, and in this echoing world, Messalina's brightness could not remain untouched. Her feasts had dazzled, her generosity had charmed, her laughter had softened hearts, but brilliance in Rome was always double. The more she shone, the more shadows gathered around her. The whispers that once spoke only of indulgence grew sharper now. Senators, who had long tolerated her as a young empress radiant in her charm, began to wonder aloud, though never in public, whether her influence over Claudius had become too great. They questioned whether decisions that bore the emperor's seal carried within them the imprint of her wishes. Some said that petitions won in her presence were decided by her smile rather than by law. Others muttered that the favor she granted to artists and freedmen weakened the noble dignity of Rome's ancient families. In truth, it was not indulgence they feared, but for every poet she welcomed, every guest she honored, every freedman she elevated, the old order felt its foundation tremble, and so resentment took root, small at first, but spreading, until it formed a quiet, invisible network of discontent. Messalina, if she felt it, gave little sign. She continued to move with the same confidence, to smile with the same ease, to laugh with the same lightness. She welcomed poets still, opened her gardens still, filled her halls with music and fragrance still. Perhaps she believed that joy was stronger than envy, that generosity could silence suspicion, or perhaps she chose not to dwell on the mutterings of those who could never see her as anything more than a rival to their traditions. But around her, the atmosphere thickened. What had once been admiration tinged with envy became envy tinged with hostility, and envy, in Rome, was never idle. It stirred schemes, it sharpened ambitions, it gave birth to alliances built not on love, but on shared resentment. In quiet corners, men of rank who rarely agreed on anything found themselves united in their unease about the Empress who seemed to weave the empire into her orbit. Claudius, steady and loyal, may have heard these whispers too, but he remained, outwardly at least, firm in his devotion. He defended her name when challenged, spoke warmly of her when questioned, and appeared, to all who looked, as an emperor who stood beside his wife without wavering. Whether he did so from love, from habit, or from blindness, no one could say for certain. Yet, love and loyalty, even from an emperor, were not always enough to shield against the shifting winds of Rome. The Senate had its own currents, and power its own hunger, and within the palace itself, ambition whispered in the shadows, reminding Messalina that even the brightest presence was not invulnerable. Still, she lived as though the brightness could endure forever. She strolled through her gardens, the air heavy with jasmine and roses. She sat at feasts where golden light danced upon polished cups. She leaned close to guests, her laughter rising like music. She wore silks that shimmered like the surface of water, and jewels that caught the glow of lamps. But even in these moments, there were sin small, fleeting, but present. A guest who bowed with less warmth than before, a senator whose smile did not reach his eyes, a servant whose silence seemed heavier than the duties he performed. Tiny details easily dismissed, yet each a thread in a larger weave that grew ever more complex. It was not only envy that stirred, but ambition, for in Rome, no figure could rise so high without creating rivals who longed to claim that height for themselves. To some, Messalina's brilliance was not only threatening, it was tempting. If she could bend Rome to her will with beauty and charm, why could they not? If she could shape the emperor's choices, why should they not try to shape hers or undo her altogether? Such questions lingered in the air, never spoken in her presence, but felt all the same. The palace, though filled with music, held also a silence threaded with unease. And as the silence deepened, Messalina's legend grew more complicated. To some, she was still joy made flesh. To others, she was a shadow cast upon the dignity of Rome. The paradox of her life grew sharper. She was beloved, yet resented, radiant, yet envied, powerful, yet vulnerable. The people adored her, but the nobles distrusted her. Claudius stood by her, but the Senate watched her. She could dazzle a hall with laughter, yet stir suspicion simply by existing. And all the while, beneath the surface, unseen currents gathered strength, like a tide drawing back before the force of its return. Messalina walked within this paradox with the grace of someone who refused to bow to fear. Perhaps she believed the tide would never turn, that her charm would always prevail. Or perhaps she knew that tides must turn, but chose to shine while they still held. And so the city continued to hold its breath. Rome, ever watchful, ever restless, waited to see what fate would bring to its Empress Anne, Empress who had woven herself into its very heartbeat, but who now felt the weight of shadows pressing more closely than ever before. The air in Rome seemed to shift as the days wore on, as though the city itself knew that change was coming. In the forum, voices still rang out with the business of trade. Senators still argued beneath the marble arches, and children still played at the edges of fountains, their laughter mingling with the hum of daily life. Yet behind these familiar rhythms, there was an undercurrent, quiet, restless tension, as though Rome was waiting for something it could not yet name. Messalina, radiant as ever, walked through her days with the same grace that had enchanted so many. Her gardens bloomed still, her halls glowed still, her laughter carried still, like the music of water flowing over smooth stones. To her closest companions, it seemed as though nothing had changed. Yet beneath the surface, the threads of her life began to loosen, pulled apart not by one hand alone, but by many. In the palace, whispers multiplied. Servants, once quick to praise, now exchanged glances when her back was turned. Courtiers, once eager to bask in her presence, grew more cautious, their words chosen with care, their smiles offered with restraint. It was not sudden, but gradual, a quiet cooling that spread outward like the fading warmth of embers. She noticed it in small ways, a delay in a message, a hesitation in a greeting, the absence of familiar faces at gatherings where once her halls overflowed. Among the senators, suspicion hardened into quiet resolve. For years they had tolerated her brilliance, her indulgence, even her influence over the emperor. But now, her power seemed less like an ornament and more like a threat. To them, she had become a force that blurred the lines of tradition, unsettling the balance of their world. Their discontent, once scattered, began to gather into something sharper, something that could no longer be ignored. Still, Claudius remained by her side, his loyalty a steady flame in the gathering shadows. He spoke of her with warmth, he smiled at her with affection, he defended her name when challenged. Yet even his devotion could not entirely shield her from the winds that turned against her. For though he was emperor, Claudius was also surrounded by advisers who whispered of danger, by senators who urged caution, by a city that fed on rumor as much as bread. And so, the tension grew. Messalina, once the jewel of the empire, became instead its question mark. Her feasts, once celebrated, were now scrutinized. Her generosity, once admired, was now criticized as her charm, once irresistible, was now painted by rivals as manipulation. The very qualities that had raised her high were now used as arguments against her, as though the world had turned the mirror upon her and chosen to see her in a darker light. She must have felt it, even if she did not speak of it, for though she continued to laugh, her laughter at times held an edge of wariness. Though she continued to host her gatherings, she did so with fewer guests. Though she continued to move with confidence, her eyes lingered more often on the faces around her, as though measuring their intentions. The truth was that Messalina was no longer only an empress, she was a symbol, and symbols in Rome could never remain still. They were lifted high or cast down, embraced or rejected, celebrated or destroyed. She, who had once symbolized joy and beauty, was now recast by her enemies as a warning, a shadow, a threat to Rome's dignity. And yet, beneath this shifting tide, there was still the pulse of her humanity. She was not only the empress whose name was whispered in the Senate, She was also a woman, living her life in rooms filled with soft light and quiet fears. She walked among her children. She spoke gently to those who still loved her. She touched the flowers in her garden, as though grounding herself in their simplicity. She lingered near fountains where the sound of water might soothe her restless heart. Perhaps she hoped still to outshine the envy that gathered around her. Perhaps she believed that beauty, kindness, and charm could yet soften the resolve of those who now watched her with cold eyes. Or perhaps she knew that the tide had shifted beyond recall and chose instead to meet it with grace, unwilling to surrender her brightness even as shadows closed in. The Senate, however, was not moved by beauty or by charm. It was moved by power, by control, by the ancient weight of tradition. And to those who guarded that tradition, Messalina had become too bright, too free, too unrestrained. She had lived as though Rome itself were her stage, and in doing so, she had forgotten that there were those who would never forgive her for playing a role greater than the one they wished her to keep. Thus, in chambers hidden from her sight, plans began to form. Words were exchanged, not in the open, but in quiet corners, in letters sealed with wax, in conversations carried by trusted messengers. The details mattered less than the direction. The Empress, they whispered, must be undone. She knew nothing of these schemes, not yet, for in her world, the lamps still glowed. The music still played, and the garden still breathed with the fragrance of roses. Yet even within these familiar comforts, there was a subtle change, as though the city itself leaned away from her, preparing for the moment when her light would dim. The unraveling had begun not in a single gesture, not in a single word, but in the slow accumulation of doubts, resentments, and ambitions. And as Rome, restless and watchful, waited to see how the story would turn, Messalina continued to live as she had always lived, with grace, with radiance, with the belief that her presence could yet hold the world together. But history moves in tides, and tides do not pause for the wishes of even the most radiant souls. The waves that had lifted her high now gathered strength to pull her down, and though she could not yet see their full force, she felt their pull in the distance, faint but undeniable, like the deep rumble of thunder far away. And so the stage was set. The city was waiting, and the Empress, still radiant in her twilight, stood unknowingly at the edge of a story that would soon carry her into its final chapters. The palace of Claudius, once a haven for Messalina, grew heavier with each passing day. Its marble columns still gleamed in the sunlight. Its corridors still echoed with the steps of servants and guards. Yet to her ears, those echoes seemed to change. They sounded less like the music of daily life and more like distant drums, steady and foreboding, hinting at movements she could not yet see. Messalina still moved through those halls as an empress. She still wore her silks, still smiled with her familiar radiance, still spoke with the grace that had charmed Rome. But behind her eyes, there must have been unease. She felt the hesitations of those who once leaned close. She noticed the way conversations faltered when she entered, the way laughter that once bubbled freely now dimmed, as though the presence of the Empress required restraint. Her enemies were no longer whispering alone. They were aligning. Senators long frustrated by her presence found common cause with freedmen at the heart of the palace. These were men who owed their rank to Claudius, but who knew also that his trust was not limitless. They began to murmur of loyalty to the emperor, of threats to his dignity, of dangers in his own household, and slowly, piece by piece, they drew a picture of Messalina not as a wife or mother or hostess, but as a danger to Rome itself. Still, Claudius resisted. His love for her was not easily shaken. To him, she remained the woman whose laughter had warmed his days, whose beauty lit his evenings. He defended her when rumors reached his ears, brushing them aside as envy or invention. His devotion was sincere, yet it was also vulnerable, for those who spoke against her learned to choose their words with care. They framed their warnings not as personal attacks, but as concern for the emperor's safety, his honor, his place in history. Messalina, meanwhile, continued her life of radiance. She hosted gatherings, though smaller now, her guests fewer and more cautious. She walked in her gardens, the roses blooming as though untouched by the shadows lengthening in the city. She offered kindness to those around her, perhaps hoping that generosity would disarm suspicion. But beneath these gestures, the truth was harder. She was a woman living within a narrowing circle, her world contracting even as she stretched to keep it whole. Rome itself was restless. In taverns and marketplaces, rumors thrived. They grew in the telling, as rumors always do. Some spoke of the Empress's extravagance, others of her boldness, others still of secrets whispered in her chambers. Whether true or false, the effect was the same. She became a story that everyone felt entitled to retell. The more her name passed from lip to lip, the more she ceased to be a person and became instead a legend of scandal, a symbol of danger, a caution wrapped in beauty. And perhaps Messalina, sensing this, leaned all the more on the very charms that had once carried her so high. When eyes grew cold, she smiled brighter. When words grew harsh, she spoke softer. When doors seemed to close, she opened her own halls with warmth, as though to prove that she was still beloved, still indispensable, still Rome's empress in more than name. But charm, though powerful, cannot forever outshine fear, and those who gathered against her understood this. They did not move openly, for Claudius's devotion was still strong. Instead, they moved with patience, like hunters circling their prey, waiting for the moment when the emperor's doubts could be sharpened into certainty. The first cracks came quietly. A trusted servant delayed in answering her call. A letter she expected did not arrive. A gift she sent was received without thanks. These were not accusations, not confrontations, but they were signs, and signs are often more wounding than words, for they suggest not an enemy in the open, but a world slipping quietly from one's grasp. Still, there were moments when her brilliance shone as it always had. She laughed with her children, her voice like music in the stillness of the garden. She watched plays in the theater, the flicker of torches casting golden light upon her face. She dined with Claudius, leaning close, her presence a reminder of the bond they had built. For in those moments, she must have believed, or wished to believe, that her world was intact, that the whispers were nothing more than shadows that would pass. But shadows, once gathered, do not disperse so easily. They deepen, they stretch, they merge into something larger. And so it was with Messalina's world. The senators grew bolder in their warnings, the freedmen more insistent in their counsel, the servants more distant in their loyalty. And though she held herself with poise, though she carried her beauty like armor, she could not stop the tide from rising. There was, too, the matter of her desires, those impulses that had always driven her, that had both enchanted and unsettled Rome. She had lived as though passion were not a thing to be hidden, but a gift to be embraced. Yet what had once seemed bold now seemed reckless in the eyes of her enemies. Her very nature became fuel for the fire against her, as though the freedom she embodied was itself a crime too great to forgive. Thus the stage drew closer to its climax. The palace, the senate, the city each played its part in the slow tightening of the net. Messalina, radiant still, walked within it, unaware of how little space remained. She was like a dancer continuing her steps long after the music had begun to fade, determined to keep the rhythm alive even as silence crept in from the edges. The plots were not yet ready to strike, but they were no longer mere whispers. They were plans with form, with direction, with intention, and those who made them knew that their moment was near. For history does not wait forever, and neither does ambition. And so Messalina, still luminous in her twilight, drifted closer to the point where the story of her life would bend. Around her, the city held its breath, waiting for the break that all seemed to sense must come. And though she smiled, though she laughed, though she touched her roses with the gentlest of hands, she stood already at the edge of a fate that no charm could undo. The air of Rome was heavy with expectation. It was not a storm that burst suddenly from the sky, but rather the kind that gathers over days, its clouds swelling slowly until the light itself feels dimmed. In the corridors of power, in the whispered conversations of freedmen, in the deliberations of senators, there was a sense that something must soon shift. Messalina still walked with her usual elegance, but she was no longer the figure untouched by rumor. Even those who once adored her now looked with caution. To some, she was still dazzling. To others, she was dangerous. And in the palace, where each gesture carried weight, the smallest glance became a clue. The smallest word, a possible sign of change. The Emperor Claudius, as ever, lingered between love and doubt. His heart held her as the woman who had shared his table, who had borne him children, who had filled the quiet of his life with warmth. Yet his mind, urged by counselors and pressed by freedmen, began to turn uneasily. They spoke of loyalty, of Rome's dignity, of the honor of his name. They pressed, not with cruelty but with a steady rhythm, as though water dripping upon stone, wearing down the emperor's resistance little by little. Among those who shaped these whispers was Narcissus, his freedman, a man of keen mind and sharper instincts. Narcissus knew the emperor's heart, but he also knew the dangers of indecision. He framed his warnings carefully, not as slanders, but as truths too urgent to ignore. And in time, those truths began to take root, not as certainty, but as questions that gnawed at Claudius's peace. Perhaps sensing these currents, sought to hold her place with all the grace that had always been hers. She dressed with the same care, spoke with the same charm, smiled with the same warmth. She sought to remind Claudius of their bond, of the intimacy they had shared, of the world they had built together, and for moments she succeeded. The emperor would soften, his doubts fading beneath her presence, as though her very nearness was proof against accusation. Yet shadows do not vanish so easily. Each time she left his side, the whispers returned. Each time he sat with his freedmen, they placed before him new signs, new stories, new fears, and so his heart was caught in a cycle, warmed by her presence, cooled by their words, never at rest, always turning. The city itself played its part. Rome was alive with rumor, and rumor has a way of shaping reality. People spoke of Messalina not as a queen but as a tale. Some said she was reckless, others that she was ambitious beyond measure, others still that she had bound even Claudius himself in a net of desire. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. She was no longer merely an empress, she was an idea, and ideas cannot be so easily silenced. Her enemies waited for the moment when idea and action could meet. They knew Claudius must be brought to a point where doubt became belief, and belief became decision. Until then, they wove their plans, not rushing, but preparing, patient as the tide. Messalina, though, lived as if the tide might yet turn in her favor. She still hosted gatherings, though with fewer guests, still moved through her gardens, still leaned close to her children with tenderness. In those moments, perhaps, she clung to the illusion of safety, or perhaps she knew the truth and simply chose to resist it with beauty, as though to say, if this world is to slip from me, I will not let it go in fear, but in grace. But grace, however luminous, could not halt the turning of events. In the Senate, her name was spoken more openly. In the palace, her gestures were watched with keener eyes. Among the freedmen, plans began to shift from whispers to steps. Narcissus in particular grew bold, for he knew that hesitation was dangerous, and that the time to act was drawing close. The moment that would bring matters to their height was not yet fully upon her. But the air was heavy with its approach, like a sky holding thunder just beyond the horizon. And though the city still moved with its daily life, merchants calling in the streets, children running through courtyards, soldiers marching along the stone roads beneath it all, there was tension, like a string drawn tight, waiting for the note to be struck. Messalina remained radiant, but her radiance was now like a candle in a chamber where the walls pressed closer. It burned as brightly as ever, yet it could not keep the darkness from advancing, and those who loved her, those who feared her, those who envied her all, felt that soon the balance would tip. For history, patient though it may be, does not wait forever, and the story of Messalina was nearing the moment where charm and power, love and fear, beauty and betrayal, would collide. The silence that often precedes decisive events is not empty. It is filled with the weight of anticipation. In Rome, that silence had been building, pressed with whispers, threaded with suspicions, and shadowed by preparations. For Messalina, life still unfolded in familiar patterns, yet the ground beneath her was shifting. She did not see it crumble all at once, but in small fractures that spread quietly, like cracks forming in marble, beautiful still, but fragile. The center of the storm would come not from some wild confrontation, but from a union. It was said that Messalina, in her boldness, or perhaps in her wariness, turned her heart or her ambition toward another man. His name was Gaius Silius, a Roman noble of striking presence. He was handsome, admired, respected by many. In him, Messalina saw a companion not only of charm but of strength, someone who could stand beside her as Claudius, in his age and his distracted nature, no longer could. The story of her bond with Silius is told in many ways, each colored by the pens of historians. Some describe it as love, passionate and consuming. Others paint it as ambition, a calculated move to secure a future where she might rule more openly. Yet in truth, it may have been both. Messalina was a woman who understood desire, but also the weight of power. To bind herself to Silius was not simply an affair, it was a declaration, quiet at first, but one that would echo loudly through Rome. their union grew bolder. What had begun as whispers became harder to conceal. The palace, with its ever-watchful eyes, noticed, servants saw gestures, companions noted absences, and those who bore no love for her carried tales eagerly. In the city, rumor grew fat on these details, spreading them from atrium to forum, until it seemed that half of Rome spoke of the Empress and her noble lover. It might have remained scandal only, were it not for what followed. For Messalina and Silius did not keep their bond hidden. They dared to stage something far more dangerous, a marriage. It is said that, while Claudius lived, they held a ceremony as though he did not. Whether it was done in passion or calculation, whether it was a ritual meant to bind them, or a political act meant to stake a claim, it shocked even those who had long tolerated her freedom. For in Rome, marriage was not a private matter, but a public one. A contract that touched not only families but the state itself. To Claudius's freedmen, this was the proof they had waited for. Narcissus, who had long warned his master, now seized the moment. He told Claudius, not in whispers but in clear, urgent words, the Empress had betrayed him not only in body but in name. She had wedded another man, and in doing so, threatened to place another in the seat of power. It was not merely a wife's betrayal, it was treason against the Emperor himself. Claudius, stunned, could scarcely believe it. His heart warred with his ears. To think that the woman who had shared his life, his table, his children, had turned so openly against him was almost beyond comprehension. Yet the evidence pressed upon him from all sides. His freedmen, his counselors, even the Senate began to murmur. What had once been only rumor was now presented as fact. While Claudius hesitated, Narcissus acted. He knew that hesitation could be fatal. If Messalina and Silius gathered enough support, the emperor himself could be displaced. Rome had seen such upheavals before, and the memory of those shifts lingered. A rival with the Empress at his side could become not merely a scandal but a threat to the throne. And so, while Claudius still lingered in doubt, Narcissus moved to secure his place. He summoned guards loyal to the emperor, men who would act not for love of Claudius alone but for the stability of Rome. He presented the matter not as a domestic issue but as a danger to the empire. The emperor's wife had betrayed him, and her betrayal carried with it the seeds of rebellion. Action must be taken before those seeds could take root. Messalina, it is said, did not at first grasp the depth of her danger. She believed still in her charm, in her ability to turn Claudius back toward her, as she had so many times before. Perhaps she thought that her beauty, her words, her tears, could undo what rumor and conspiracy had wrought. And perhaps, for a brief moment, she was right. Claudius's heart still trembled toward her, still longed for the warmth that had once been his, but Narcissus would not allow it. He knew the emperor's weakness, and he guarded against it with vigilance. He kept Messalina from his presence, ensuring that her voice, which had swayed him so many times, would not be heard again. Instead, the emperor heard only the voices of those who spoke of betrayal, of danger, of Rome's honor. In the city, Messalina and Silius realized too late that the tide had turned. Guards moved, orders were given, and the quiet strength of Rome's machinery shifted against them. Silius, once admired and noble, now stood marked as traitor. He could not flee the weight of the empire. He was taken, accused, and swiftly condemned. For Rome had little patience for those who threatened its emperor, no matter how noble their lineage. Messalina, meanwhile, lingered between hope and despair. She sent messages, she sought allies, she pleaded for time. She wished to see Claudius, to look upon him once more, to use the force of her presence to melt his doubts. But the door remained closed. Narcissus ensured that no such meeting would occur, for he knew that if she stood before him, Claudius might falter, and so she waited in gardens that had once been her refuge but were now her prison. The air around her was heavy, the silence broken only by the steps of guards who watched her. She, who had been mistress of Rome's pleasures, now found herself powerless, her fate hanging not upon her will but upon the decisions of others. It is said that even then she did not lose her grace. She moved through those final hours with dignity, as though to remind herself, and perhaps those who watched, that she was still the Empress, still Messalina, still the woman who had once held the heart of the emperor and the fascination of the city. But grace, however radiant, could not stop the march of consequence. The moment of reckoning had arrived. What began as whispers of scandal had grown into a declaration of betrayal, and what might once have been forgiven as passion was now marked as treason. Rome had turned, and in its turning, Messalina's place at the heart of empire was lost. The autumn air of Rome had grown cooler by the time the fate of Messalina was sealed. The city, which had once thrummed with her name, now whispered it differently, tinged not with admiration, not even with scandal, but with foreboding. To the people, her story was no longer a private tale of passion, but a public question of loyalty, of stability, of the empire's very order. The Empress who had danced so boldly across the stage of Rome's life now stood on its edges, her future held by men who measured not her beauty but her danger. While Messalina lingered in her gardens under watchful guard, Claudius sat removed, troubled and weary. His heart was not fashioned for such storms. He was a man who longed for quiet, for the order of books and the rhythm of governance, not for the turbulence of betrayal. And yet, betrayal was what surrounded him. His freedmen pressed him with urgency, their voices layering one upon another until he could scarcely hear his own doubts. Narcissus, ever sharp and deliberate, reminded him that hesitation was peril, that mercy was weakness, that an emperor could not allow such treason to breathe. Still, Claudius hesitated. In the chambers of his heart, Messalina's laughter lingered, her presence warmed. She had been his wife, the mother of his children, the companion of his days. To sign her death was to wound himself as well. He spoke of perhaps granting her a hearing, of perhaps seeing her once more, of allowing her to explain, to weep, to beg forgiveness, but Narcissus feared this softness. He knew the power she wielded over Claudius, not with armies or decrees, but with presence, with eyes that could disarm, with words that could bend him toward her will. If they were to end her reign, she must never be allowed to stand before him again. And so the freedmen acted where the emperor faltered. Narcissus, wielding the authority granted him, moved swiftly. He dispatched men to carry out what Claudius could not say aloud, but had allowed in silence. To the guards, the command was clear. Messalina must not see the emperor again. Her story must end before it had the chance to shift once more. In her gardens, Messalina felt the change in the air. A woman such as she, attuned to the movements of power, could sense the approach of finality. The guards did not meet her eyes as they once had. Their steps were heavier, their silence deeper. She walked among the trees, beneath branches that had once shielded her from the summer sun, and felt the weight of their stillness press upon her. It is said that, in those last hours, she was offered the chance to end her life by her own hand. As was the custom of Rome's nobility when faced with condemnation. To die by one's own choice was to keep a fragment of dignity, to shape the manner of one's departure, even if not the moment. A dagger was placed near her, its cold metal glinting faintly in the fading light. But Messalina, though bold in life, faltered in death. Her courage, which had carried her through intrigues and scandals, through seductions and schemes, wavered when faced with the blade. Her hands trembled. Her heart, so fierce in its desires, was unready to let go. She reached for the dagger but could not drive it home. Tears touched her cheeks, and her breaths came shallow. She lingered between resolve and fear, unable to make the final choice. In the end, it was not her hand that ended her story. The guard, ordered and unyielding, did what she could not. The steel that she had hesitated to wield was wielded for her, and with it, the life of Messalina slipped quietly into silence. The gardens that had once echoed with her voice fell still, their air heavy with the finality of what had been done. News of her death spread quickly through the city. Some received it with relief, others with sorrow, others still with the hushed awe that follows the fall of the mighty. For Rome had watched her rise, had marveled at her freedom, had whispered of her boldness, and now it watched her fall. Claudius, when told, is said to have shown little outward grief. Perhaps he had prepared himself for this moment, or perhaps the weight of empire forced him into stillness. Yet it is hard to imagine that he did not feel it deeply. He had loved her once, had shared his life with her, and though betrayal had turned his heart cold, the wound must have lingered. Some say that when the subject of Messalina was mentioned in later days, Claudius would not speak of her at all. Silence became his answer, as though her name itself carried too much pain. And so, the story of Messalina closed not with a grand spectacle in the forum, not with the roaring of crowds or the clash of armies, but with the quiet fall of a woman in a garden, far from the throne she had once adorned. Her end was as personal as her life had been public, as silent as her passions had been loud. Yet even in death, her presence endured. Rome could not forget her. Her name lingered as a lesson, as a warning, as a tale told in hushed voices across centuries. Some remembered her as a woman of great vice, others as a victim of her own desires, others still as the reflection of an empire's contradictions where power and pleasure, duty and desire were forever entwined. The gardens where she died would continue to bloom, indifferent to the dramas they had witnessed. The city would march forward, emperors would rise and fall, but Messalina's shadow would linger, for she had been more than a wife, more than an empress. She had been a mirror of Rome itself, brilliant, flawed, dangerous, captivating. Time has a way of softening the sharpest edges, of turning what was once immediate and urgent into something distant, almost dreamlike. So it is with Messalina. Her life, lived with such intensity, ended in a quiet garden with little ceremony, yet it has echoed through centuries, as though Rome itself could not let her name be forgotten. The Messalina remembered by history is painted in bold strokes, an empress of passions, of scandals, of reckless pursuits. Ancient chroniclers, with their pens sharpened by politics and moral judgment, wrote of her as a woman consumed by desire, as one who placed pleasure above duty, indulgence above restraint. To them, she was a symbol of the dangers of unchecked appetite, of the ruin that follows when the heart leads the empire astray. But beneath those strokes lies a softer truth, one that whispers to us if we listen closely. Messalina was not only the creature of vice that Rome's historians describe, she was also a wife, a mother, a young woman who rose suddenly to the heights of power and found herself caught in the storm of Rome's ceaseless expectations. She was human, and like all who bear the weight of humanity, she stumbled. Her flaws were magnified by the crown she wore, her private choices becoming public lessons, her mistakes magnified into legend. It is worth remembering that the voices who recorded her life were not her own. The scrolls that speak of her were penned by men who saw in her story a chance to warn, to moralize, to shape Rome's memory for their own purposes. In their telling, she becomes more symbol than woman, more warning than memory. Perhaps she was guilty of the charges laid upon her, or perhaps she was the victim of a narrative crafted to protect others' power. The truth, like so much in Rome's past, lies buried beneath layers of retelling. What remains clear is that Messalina embodied the contradictions of her age. She was both beloved and despised, powerful and powerless, exalted and destroyed. She could bend an emperor's heart, yet she could not bend the will of those who surrounded him. She lived in luxury beyond imagining, yet in the end, she died alone, with only the silent trees as witnesses. Her story lingers because it touches upon something universal. We see in her rise the allure of power, in her indulgences the temptations that call to all humankind, and in her fall the inevitable weight of consequence. She reminds us that empire, no matter how vast, is still shaped by the intimate choices of individuals, by their desires, their flaws, their humanity. As Rome itself continued to rise and stumble, to build and to fall, Messalina remained as a shadow in its memory. Later emperors and empresses would walk the same marble halls, would gaze upon the same gardens, yet her story would hover there, a quiet warning and a lingering fascination. Poets would whisper her name, chroniclers would debate her deeds, and centuries later, she would be remembered not as she was, but as history chose to paint her. And now, as we look back across the long sweep of time, her tale unfolds not as scandal, but as part of the great mosaic of human life. It reminds us that beneath crowns and titles, beneath the grandeur of empire, people are still people. They love, they err, they reach for too much, they fall, and yet they remain. The Messalina who walks through the gardens of memory is both empress and woman, both myth and truth. Her laughter may be gone, her steps long faded, but her presence lingers in the echo of her name. She has become part of the timeless chorus of history, one voice among many, yet still distinct, still heard. And so, as the story of Messalina closes, let it close not with judgment, but with stillness. Let it drift like the evening air over Rome, soft and cool, settling over the stones of the city that once knew her. Her life was fleeting, her power fragile, her choices flawed, yet she lived, and in living, she became part of the eternal tale that binds us all, the tale of human striving, of desire and downfall, of memory and forgetting. The marble of Rome remains, the empire long since dust, yet the stories endure. Messalina's among them, carried across centuries not because she was perfect, but because she was human. And with that thought, let us allow her story to rest, fading gently into the quiet, where the Empress at last finds peace, and where sleep may come upon us, soft as the hush of time itself.